good afternoon. Thank you, Rena and team. What a tremendous turnout you have. I can feel your brains buzzing with activity and really clever thoughts. And certainly this morning, we had some wonderful pearls of wisdom shared with us. And thank you to my fellow panelists who have also just given us some really good food for thought. So my name is Kirsty. I have up there a slide that's going to be quite different to all the rest of my slides because this is a bit of what I do. By way of introduction, I work on an initiative called the Global Transition 2012. I work with the New Economics Institute, the New Economics Foundation, the Green Economy Coalition and others to think about the transition to the new economy, and in particular, currently in the context of Rio+20 that's happening in June. I'm sure you all know lots and lots about Rio+20, but thinking about key elements of the transition. And the title of this conference, or the theme of this conference really, is the transition to the new economy. And that's what I'm really interested in. I think we're very good at imagining the alternatives in the future, where do we ultimately want to end up. And I think we're very good at deconstructing the various problems, the institutions that uphold the status quo that keep us from moving forward into the direction that we want to see. But really what I'd like to focus on, and I'd like to have your input on this in a question and answer session afterwards, is what does the transition mean? How are we going to have a fair transition? How are we going to have a just transition? And how are we going to have a transition that doesn't harm, but rather ultimately brings about public good? I'm going to use a model that was developed by something called the Bacana Institute, and it's called the Two Loops Principle of Systems Change. And just before this session, I was sat in this room listening to the environment track talking about paradigms, and more than once this word came up, what is the new paradigm, what is the old paradigm, and so on. So I'm going to try and offer a bit of an analysis of the old paradigm, the new paradigm, but how can we bridge the two, what's missing in between? And that's the website, because I think that the Bacana Institute offers some really, really useful thinking on shifting from an old paradigm to a new paradigm. And I've applied the overall framework to what I think is relevant to this conference, which is the new economy. So here we have the old paradigm. And there are various things that make up the old paradigm. So you might consider, and it's been said earlier today, the financial institution upholds the old to the current paradigm of the financial institution. You might also say that the UN, in its various shapes and forms, upholds some of the current status quo, something that we might class as the old paradigm. You might see things as indicators like GDP, or you might think about the capitalist system and various others. I'm sure you can think eloquently yourself about what it is that is upholding the old paradigm. And then we need to think about what makes up the new paradigm. And we've had speakers today talk about beyond GDP, new indices of measuring social progress. What does happiness mean in a new economy? So we might start to think about how we can actually measure that and how can we incorporate that into the new economy. Does the UN play a role in the new system, in the new economy? What elements of the UN can we take from the old paradigm and place it into the new paradigm? You might also think about educational institutions. I'm sure you will have lots of ideas about other things, maybe incorporating sustainability criteria into sovereign wealth funds, for instance, or credit rating agencies. But crucially, the question is, how do we bridge from the old to the new? And I think just before this session, I pulled a few quotes from previous speakers. And here we have one from Gar. It says, he said this morning, if you build it, then its time will come. So I think that was quite a useful quote to share there, thinking about how do we bridge from the old to the new. It's taking the first step. As we know, every 1,000-mile journey begins with one step. What does it mean, taking the first step? Who is it that exists or upholds the old paradigm? It might be bankers, it might be, and I confess here, maybe somebody like me who actually works with the UN, or it might be somebody that has a very strong interest in keeping a pension policy supporting fossil fuel industries. how can a person who is so entrenched or has an interest in upholding the old paradigm consider what a new paradigm would look like? What are the first steps that we need to take to have the conversations in this room taken out to the financial institutions, taken back into the UN, taken out into legal firms, and so on? And again, I think this was really pertinent, a quote by Sheila earlier. The Western tradition spent 2,500 years questioning the power we gave to governments. So why aren't we questioning the power that we give to corporations? If we're thinking about the transition, there are three, probably more, but I'm just going to focus on three, really crucial individuals who are going to help us move from the status quo to the new paradigm. And I just thought I'd frame it by saying that not all things that can be counted count, and not all things that you can count can be counted. So pioneers, innovators, and enablers. Over there you see a star. This is somebody who you might see as a pioneer of the new system. It might be the Transition Town movement. It might be the New Economics Institute who established a system of local currency in the Berkshires, for instance. You have dotted around in thinking about what the new economy is, people who are democratizing money, for instance. How can you bring about different governance systems for thinking about money? How can we think about local currencies, time shares, time banks, and so on? Then you also have innovators. Who are the people that sort of exist on this, if you're looking at it, far left part of the curve? Who are the innovators thinking up? And I would say that probably a lot of us in this room here are innovators. You have lots of bright ideas. I'm sure you're writing excellent theses on your vision for the new economy and dismantling the capitalist system and bringing about the new economy. That's great. These are really innovative ideas. So potentially you might see yourself as fitting there as an innovator in the new paradigm. But then within the current system, maybe you have enablers. So perhaps it might be a foundation that built up its wealth of money in the banking industry that is able to fund, say for instance, a project or an initiative on the ground. You might see that as enabling some of the innovators and pioneers to take their work forward. It might be a lawyer who is able to defend their climate activist friend when they are arrested for trying to close down a coal-fired power station. A couple of other people might exist in the space between. So it might be somebody who is starting up a project or taking on board a new project and going forward. Then crucially, at what point, if we're thinking about the transition to the new system, the new economy, at what point do we need to think about maybe leaving my job in the UN, for instance? Or if I was a banker, at what point do I take a step back and think, what I'm doing is upholding a system that I don't necessarily believe in, so can I take some steps into, say, being an innovator or indeed even perhaps a pioneer? And both Gar and Sheila, I think, made this point very eloquently, that the radical discourse can and must be linked to practice. So if you're existing somewhere up here, thinking about what the innovation is, what the pioneering initiative is, how do you actually turn it into practice? So supporting the emergence of the new. Just when the caterpillar thought that the world was ending, it turned into a butterfly. How can we see perhaps the last 20, maybe 40 years? We had Sheila speak about 1978, I think she said she graduated, and that's when with her JD, but wasn't taught formally about environmental law, but was really keen to go into this area of an area of law that was just beginning. So how can we see the last 20 years, perhaps not necessarily, and I would contend, not a regression, but actually a learning curve? And if you look at the two parabolas here, you see that if you are thinking about transitioning to the new economy, there potentially has to be this period of learning that may, at the time, feel like regression. It may, at the time, feel like failure, dare I say it. I hear so often many NGOs talking about the last 20, 40 years, saying that we haven't really gotten anywhere in terms of climate change. We haven't really gotten anywhere in terms of an environmental strengthening environmental regulation, and really we're just going backwards. But how can we see this as a learning to support the emergence of the new? And I think Nikos said, and I threw this quote in there, that this is the kind of capitalism that wears no clothes, and we need to call it out. I don't know if it really fits there, but I really like that quote. I just wanted to repeat it, and that was kind of where I wanted it. Okay, so Einstein again. We cannot solve the problem with the same thinking that created it in the first place. Guys, you all know this, but it's about what is the new thinking that is going to create the solution. Now, I really want to focus on this bit, because I think this is the hardest bit, in my mind at least, and in the work that I'm doing, to try and get to grips with. If we are going to transition to a new economy, as I said before, how are we going to do it in a way that is fair, just, and equitable? Because there are many people who exist in the status quo, in the old paradigm, in the old economy, that have a vested interest in it staying as it is, for their own reasons. Perhaps you might not share those reasons. But how can we consider, and this is what the Buchanan Institute talks about, hospicing the old? If we are going to have a decline of one paradigm in order to allow for the emergence of a new paradigm, something is going to have to change. The Buchanan Institute even goes so far as to say that something in the old actually has to come to an end, it has to die, in order to lay the groundwork for the emergence of the new. And I think this part here about hospicing the old, we all really need to be thinking about, because there might be some quite toxic elements in the old system that we wouldn't want to see being brought into the new system. That might be, and I forget who spoke about it before, but if we are over-competitive and not cooperative, where does that lead us in a new economy, for instance? Is that a principle that we want to transfer from the old paradigm to the new? What other negative principles might exist bubbling up in the decline of an old paradigm that if we don't detoxify it, what we're going to end up with is these toxic principles, you might call them, embedding themselves in the fertile ground that we have laid as the new paradigm is emerging. And I really have a question about this in relation to, say, the transition to the green economy, that this is very in vogue at the UN at the moment, not least because it is one of the themes of the Rio +20 conference. If I'm a coal miner and somebody says you need to get a green job, that's all very well to say it in principle, but in practice, how can I then wake up tomorrow and build a wind turbine? What elements, how can I be upskilled? How can I move into a new economy that supports me and the work that I've been doing in a way that helps the emergence of the new? A few more lightning bolts there, I think I've put over them. And the question again from Nikos, the statement, we have a financial system that is on drugs, and one day we're going to wake up, and we're going to have a bit of a hangover. And I think that does fit in with this slide, because if the status quo is on drugs and we are going to go cold turkey, what does that mean? What does that mean for people who are so entrenched? And I think it needs to be a people-centric approach here for it to be fair, equitable, and just. Never doubt that a small body of determined spirits, fired by their unquenchable faith in their mission, can alter the course of history. So I put it to you that you are a determined body of spirits, and no doubt you are fired by your unquenchable faith in your mission, and you will alter the course of history. What does that mean? How can we bring compassion into this, into illuminating the old, into hospicing the old? How can we think about a transition that isn't harmful? How can we think about a transition that doesn't necessarily result in toxic elements of an old paradigm infiltrating into the new paradigm? And how can we take that compassion and care and all sorts of other elements of a just transition, equity and fairness to ensure? Thanks guys, I appreciate that. But ultimately, when we have transitioned to the new economy, that we will have a big happy and smiley face. I did initially have the smiley faces green to kind of fit in with my green institute, but then it just looked like he had a real hangover. I went with orange in the end. And then a quote from Bob, and I think what he was saying is absolutely true. We need to challenge those deeply held assumptions that uphold the status quo. And he was speaking in the context of the apartheid regime and the challenges that were brought against the assumptions that were held that were ultimately upholding the apartheid regime. What are the assumptions that we need to be challenging, you and people in the UN, people in the financial world? What do we need to be challenging in order to think about the positive principles that can ultimately lead to a happy transition? And then because this was titled as a workshop, not a lecture, I thought that it might be quite useful just to go back to close on this slide and to ask yourselves, where do you fit in this map? Are you a pioneer? Are you an innovator? Are you an enabler? Are you thinking about going into the financial world so that you can dismantle it from the inside and take all the good pieces and bring it over to the new paradigm? Are you an innovator? Are you setting up a project? Are you developing new ideas for initiatives that can be scaled up in the next 5 to 10 years in such an exciting and radical way that it supports the pioneers who are already existing in the new paradigm? And how can we all work together to support one another to make sure that when we do get there, we have a big smiley face? So thank you very much.